Before we crack on with the video, I just wanted to let you know that iDriveAClassic is sponsored by Adrian Flux. I've also got all my cars insured with them, and I also have Flux Rescue because guess what? All my cars do break down, even if I pretend they don't. If you haven't got your car insured yet, or you're looking for a new renewal quote, click the link below and get in touch with the Adrian Flux team. Hi guys, it's Steph from iDriveAClassic, and today I'm behind the screen with a different kind of video because I shot this at the MMOC National Rally 2021, and I was sitting with the video and I thought, I don't actually really know what to do with this one. And then with all the Morris Minor content coming up this year and all the adventures I'm going on, I thought, let's turn it into a bit of a history on the Morris Minor. But first of all, we nearly didn't get to the National Rally because, and you can see my Project Morris Minor in the background there, my exhaust on the Triumph decided to break in half. I was like, great, thanks very much. So Joe decided to weld it all back up so that we could crack on. And with no further delay, I'll give you the video. A lot of people think the story of the Morris Minor begins after the war. Well, no, because it starts a lot earlier than that. So the first traces of the Minor, or well, it was unnamed at that stage, small 6 horsepower car, was conceived as a new car for Morris way before we won the war. Because when the USA joined the Allies in the Second World War, it became apparent that Allied victory would be a case of not if, but when. So, in the background, and a lot of people didn't know this, industrial companies with post war interests, just like the Nuffield organisation, were allowed to start diverting some of their resources and attention to look at post war activities. And it was Miles Thomas, who was the vice chairman of the Nuffield organisation, who said to Itagonis and his small team, get to work and get to work on a proposed small car. We're going to badge it Morris. Now, of course, we all know that the Morris Minor replaced the Morris 8, but it was never intended to. It was intended to run as a smaller car alongside the 8 to just increase the range capacity. Now, the first sketches and the mock-ups online, which you can get everywhere, but I can't show in the video because of copyright, show a really small Fiat Topolino-ish sized car. Now, it was meant to appeal to the masses. It wasn't meant to be expensive. It wasn't meant to be flashy. Because Britain coming out of the war was a damaged, war-torn landscape. Places like Coventry, Portsmouth, people think it was just London that was damaged. But even Halifax all got massive damage from bombing, from raids. It was a war-torn landscape. People didn't want flashy. So they decided to go out there with a small, no-frills economy car. And its code name, the Mosquito. Now, of course, to get things right, you need to look at various options. And so they looked at different engine types and sizes. They looked at a tiny 2-stroke, a 600cc 4-stroke, and famously a flat 4 that is said to be the cause of the wide and spacious engine bay. And then, of course, the conventional side valve, inline 4-cylinder engines, which the car ended up with initially. Because, of course, as we talked about in the last Morris Minor, it wasn't A-series from the get-go. There were quite serious plans to use an entirely new flat 4 engine, as well as a few other quite technically advanced ideas for the time, such as independent suspension all round instead of just the front as we got, and people sometimes get caught up in the what could have been trap. So it is fair to mention that when we talk about this stuff, Britain wasn't a place for lots of new things to come into plan. So while people say when the Minor came to production, it was quite dated, well, we're working in a world where we've got limited resources and we need to make things happen on a limited budget. Now, most people, if they had a car, had a basic pre-war car, something like an Austin 7 or one of the standards, and large companies like the Nuffield organisation had been used and abused to support the war effort. So Nuffield had built tanks, trucks, equipment, and operated the largest aeroplane repair facility, which was crucial in the Battle of Britain. So really, the company wasn't exactly flush with cash to make something completely new happen. So next time someone tells you the Minor was pretty dated when it came to market, you've got the argument right there and then. So the car then grew, and as prototypes went through and developed, it became more apparent that the car, being such a design leap forward, should replace the Morris 8 Series E, which had gone back into production after the war, along with the Morris 10 Series M. This then prompted the Nuffield organisation to step up to replace their entire existing Morris offerings with a newly designed post-war range. And bear in mind, they're doing this all on a budget as well. So when the Morris Minor was eventually signed off, it would be launched with two scaled-up versions to make a new range of cars. This then became, of course, the car we know as the Morris Oxford and the car we know as the Morris 6. Both of these were then adapted to become replacement New Wolseley cars, the 450 and the 680. The Minor and its two larger siblings were then officially launched by Morris on the eve of the London Earls Court Motor Show in October 1948. Now, that was a pretty exciting Earls Court Motor Show because, of course, it wasn't the only star of the show, because the XK120 sports car came into production and it was shown off there. But the Minor attracted a lot of genuine interest because, whilst the Jaguar was undoubtedly one of the most beautiful cars, a lot of people could see themselves in the Morris Minor and owning it, which had always been Isagonis's intention. And he later said that he didn't want someone to buy a small car and feel they were saddled with having something uncomfortable to live with and use because it was at the lower end of the market. He felt the car should be just as much of a pleasure to own and drive as something twice the size and three times the price. Which, on a personal note, and I've driven quite a lot of things, I would say he did very well. The car handled and drove better than any of its mostly still pre-war design rivals, and the first review published by the Autocar in December 1948 questioned why anyone needed a larger and more expensive car when the Minor gave you such a great drive. It quoted things like the usable internal space and just the general usability of the car. It was even quoted as being quite fast, but of course that was way back then. Nowadays, life is at a far more leisurely pace. Although you can get up to 70, a lot of people are very frightened to, but trust me, it's very easy once you've done it a few times. Now, the Minor, being small, low, and quite wide for its size, handled brilliantly and still does, and meant you weren't slowing at every bend to make sure you couldn't get round it without instant. Perhaps this is why a young Sterling Moss managed to get his hands on one in 1949 as his chosen runabout. Now, for me, one of the most interesting things about doing a bit of research for this video is that Morris didn't expect the Minor to be the success that it was. In fact, they thought the Oxford was going to be the market leader. So it changed the game entirely, so much so that they even had to change the factory layout to incorporate enough space to keep churning out those Morris Minors. Because remember, the Minor was only about £30 or £40 more than the cheapest car. Things like the Ford Prefect, which by this point after the war was looking quite old. Now, another interesting fact that people don't always know is they think that the low light, so where you've got the lights lower down in the wings, came up to a highlight in about 50-51. But actually, the first production highlight was built in January 49. It was the first car destined for the USA, and it had to meet the USA lighting regulations. And it meant that changes had to be quite quick. So the first wings were actually handmade, all adapted from the low light wings. So this kind of explains why the early shipping volumes to the US are incredibly low, and the early 49 highlights going out to the USA are now extremely rare. Now, change came about quite quickly. So in 1950, the first four-door saloon came out, and we talked a lot about that in the video that we did when we drove from Huddersfield down to Somerset. We talked about things like how the Korean War caused changes, and how the first four doors, in fact the only four doors that were ever made, were only ever made as highlights. Now, more changes came about in 1952, and in fact, some would say this is one of the biggest things, because in 1952, the Nuffield organisation merged with Austin, and that then formed the BMC, which was the British Motor Corporation. It then meant that the side valve was mothballed and they brought in the A series engine. At this point, it was an 803cc. Now, there was a lot of disgruntlement and bad words from the Morris men because they said that the engine was weak and the gear ratios were ill chosen, and perhaps they weren't necessarily wrong on that one when compared to the side valve. But that wasn't what it was all about, because it was about acceleration, it was about the speed, and it also meant that Morris were able to diversify their minor range. So then 4 new models came in 1953. The first being the 3 commercial variants. So it used the minor front as the cab and the mechanical underpinnings, and then you could get a van, you could get a pickup, and you could get the chassis cab. So that then meant that the minor wasn't just a car for home, it was something that people could use for work. And then, of course, you had the Traveller, or the Traveller's car as it was known, which came about in October 53. So they took that to the Earls Court Motor Show. Now, after the Traveller debuted, changes continued, and in 1954 you got the new dash, giving way to that central large speedo that a lot of people think of when they think of things like Minis and Morris Minors, and then the split windscreen, small rear window, high cut rear wings, and 803cc engine continued as they had before. But then in late 1956, the minor changed again, and then it was badged the 1000 because, of course, now it had that 948cc A series engine. The car was an improvement all round because they increased the visibility with a curved one-piece windscreen, a bigger rear window, and the gearbox had a remote selector for easier use. The ratios was improved and the final drive ratio changed, which helped the cruising ability because, of course, at this point we're almost at the dawn of the motorway, so cars are getting faster. The new Morris Minor 1000 then went through a bit of a boom period, with production ramping up right into 57, 8, and 9 as the 50s drew to a close. 1960 saw a landmark on the horizon, with a calculated 1 million production examples being in sight. So, with this, they had to do something special, and with that, the Minor Million came to market. Now, a lot of people say, why did they pick the purple? Well, of course, they'd considered silver and gold, but ICI, who made crimpline, one of my favourite fabrics, also made the paint, and unfortunately, technology just wasn't up to spec. So, with that, they put 350 cars in total into special into a special shade. It's that famous pink shade, which is officially called lilac, and the interior was finished in off-white with black piping. It had chrome wheel embellishers and altered badging to read, instead of 1000, 1 million. Now, as the swinging 60s went on, the minor gained some close relatives. Cars like the Mini, which of course you see that Speedo, designed by the same man, Alecus Agonis, but a lot of people still love the Minor, even though you could have gone for something like the ODO 16, 1100s, and 1300s, which, by the way, were the best selling cars of the 1960s. People still invested in those Morris Minors. To be fair to Morris, or now BMC, they didn't just leave it that they thought, well, we'll just leave everyone with a 948 engine. In 1962, they decided to add in the 1098. Of course, it's used in lots of things, the aforementioned ADO 16 and various other cars as well. So what they did was they then put that 1098 engine in, which was then coupled with a stronger and even easier to use gearbox. It had a taller rear differential and larger brakes. They then said, well, the car's up to date enough to continue to sell well through the 60s, and because the Morris Minor had so many loyal fans, I think they probably could have done anything and they would have just carried on selling. And the Traveller, especially, even by the late 60s, was still incredibly practical and spacious in its class, and also very popular. Now, the final revisions for the Morris Minor came about in 1965. It saw things like the non-clap hand wipers, a better heater, integrated indicator and side rear lamp units, and vinyl-only trim. PS, in my opinion, the leather is always far better wearing than the vinyl. But hey, I don't work at BMC, so I don't get a choice. Now, from that point, the car was a steady seller, with production gradually falling as the last few years of the 60s arrived. But if you think about it, the car had pretty good innings. The formation of British Leyland saw the convertible, a small percentage of the production, axed in '69, and the saloon 2 and 4-door variants in November 1970. The Traveller went on for a bit longer into 1971 with new BL colours like aqua and lime flower. But even the Traveller came to an end in 1971. The commercials, now also badged as Austins and available as 600 cubic weight and 800 cubic weight versions, had been popular buys, but they too had production all but wrapped up by the end of 1971. So that's all the end of the Morris Minor in the UK, and with a couple of CKD commercials still assembled and New Zealand. The only other car produced was a one-off 1975 car, constructed out of a sourced accident replacement new Minor 2-door body shell, and with all the other components sourced from BL or dealers. And can you believe the car cost over £2,000 to make, but was made at the request of a serial Minor owner who wouldn't have any other new car? And really, that's the testament to how much people love these vehicles, because not only do you see all the cars here on the field today, but that particular car still survives as well. So that, in short, is a bit of a history of the Morris Minor. We've got plenty of Morris Minor content coming up for this year, because my own car is nearing the end of production. We've got the Morris Minor National Rally. We've got Miners on Tour, where we're going to take these cars abroad, and plenty of other things like the Manchester Bus Museum event, and hundreds of events in between. So I thought, let's kick off the year with a bit of a history of the Morris Minor. But who would own a Morris Minor in 2022? Because, let's face it, they look pretty antiquated. They're slower than your modern car by quite a margin. And a lot of people would say, what kind of young person is going to be interested today? So I'm going to introduce you to two different owners. The first is Becca. She drives her car every single day. It's her only car, and she runs something called the Passenger Seat Podcast. So with no further delay, I'll hand you over to Becca, who'll tell you a little bit about her Morris Minor.
Hi, I'm Becca, and I'm the proud owner of Peggy, my 1968 Morris Minor. I've had her for a year now. I bought her as a pandemic car, which is part of the reason I'm here today, as it's my first event and I was really excited to meet some other Morris Minor owners. I bought Peggy as my first car. I was moving out. I could no longer go on my parents' insurance anymore, so I needed to buy a car, and dressing the way I did, it made more sense to buy a 60-year-old car than something a bit more modern. I daily drive her, and we've done some pretty big trips, including a month after buying her, travelling around Snowdonia and Wales, with 3 hours there and 3 hours back, and it was really enjoyable. I've loved my year of ownership. I've learnt lots of things, but I've still got lots more to learn. And I've also started podcasting from her because I really enjoy the sound of her engine, and I thought other people might want to listen in as well while I talk rubbish about my ownership and my experiences.
Hi, I'm Mark from Canterbury Convertibles, and I found this car in a scrapyard in Bethnal Green along with 14 others about 10 years ago. Bought all the cars for parts, but just before breaking this one up, I said to my chum, my mechanic, to check the underneath first, because I thought it was quite good, and he said it was excellent. So we just put new brakes on it, new suspension, and got it going, and I've been using it not daily but regularly ever since. She's been to Paris, made it up here 150 miles, overtaking all the Mercs of course, and she's just a good, reliable car that I don't worry about too much. I restore them all the time, so this is a good example of a cobbler in his shoes.
So that's the end of today's video. I really hope you've enjoyed it. It's been a pleasure showing you some of the cars. Sorry it took me so long to pull the video together. And keep your fingers crossed, because my car's nearly done. I cannot wait to show you it. But until next Sunday, when we go back to normal car reviews, take care and drive safely.